Okay. So today we're going to be diving deep into a case that I think will really make you think about, like where's the line between normal and just absolute chaos? It's the story of Carl Robert Brown, a teacher who did something truly awful, an act of violence back in 1982. We'll be using excerpts from his Wikipedia entry to kind of, guide us. And this one's got some wild twists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. It's I think what's so striking is that Brown's story, it really kind of turns everything we think we know about violence on its head. Like, he wasn't some troubled kid or, someone with a criminal record or anything. On paper, like, his background seemed totally normal. He was a Navy veteran, had a master's degree, was a teacher. Like, what went so wrong?
Exactly. Like you start reading and it's almost like, oh, this is a pretty normal story, right? He's born in Chicago in 1930, honorably discharged from the Navy in 54. Then he even moves to Florida, like a fresh start. He gets his education, starts his career. It's like the start of any regular American life.
And that's what's so unsettling, right? Because the sources, they describe him as, like, actually pretty outgoing at first, even, like, kept that military bearing.
Yeah.
But as time went on, things started to, well, unravel.
Like things really take a nosedive when his second marriage falls apart, and he refused to go to therapy, and his look, his appearance, got like more and more messy, disheveled. Like a neighbor even said he looked like he was 80 years old. And even his own daughter tried to have him hospitalized, but he wouldn't, agree to go voluntarily. So there was nothing they could do.
It's sad because that decline in his personal life kind of, like, went hand in hand with his professional life too. Like at Hiley Junior High, he got known for, like, making bigoted comments and giving these really rambling lectures that just left the students completely lost. And, his behavior was getting inappropriate. So eventually he was transferred to Drew Middle School, which had mostly black students at the time.
And it wasn't just like, confusing lectures, right? We're talking about like really weird behavior in the classroom. Like there's this one instance where he sent 3 girls to detention just because they were, tired of his rambling and didn't want to sit in his class anymore.
Yeah, see, these incidents, they weren't just like one-offs, like, oh, the teacher's having a bad day. They were like red flags, like a sign that there was a bigger problem. And it gets, like, even more concerning when you look at some of Brown's writing from back then. There's this letter he wrote to the principal of Hialeah Junior High, and honestly, like, the sentences are so jumbled and rambling. It's clear something's not right mentally.
Yeah, you're like reading it and you can almost like see inside his head. It's like all over the place.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, the school board's director of personnel at the time, he even said that Brown showed a lack of adult judgment, overtone of sexual fixation, and definitive aggression towards students. Like it was pretty obvious that this wasn't just some random thing.
Yeah, that's a really important point because eventually they did send him to a psychiatrist for an evaluation. And this is where things get, well, really creepy. The psychiatrist, Dr. Robert Wanger, he diagnosed Brown with severe anxiety, paranoid and grandiose ideas, and a probable thinking disorder.
Okay, wait, hold on a second. For our listeners who might not know what those terms mean, can you like break that down? Explain what those diagnoses mean, like in normal terms.
Sure, sure. Basically, paranoid and grandiose ideas mean someone might have, like, delusions of persecution or think they're way more important than they actually are. And a probable thinking disorder could mean they have trouble, like, thinking logically and processing information. And it's like their thoughts are all scrambled up.
So basically this evaluation was saying like, hey, there's some serious problems here. But what's crazy is that even with those diagnoses, the psychiatrist didn't think Brown would actually hurt anyone. You have to wonder, like, were they just like not as good at assessing risk back then?
Yeah, it definitely raises the question, like, were the methods they had back then good enough? And, what responsibility do mental health professionals have to, like, really see those signs and do something?
It's a tough one. It's like you want to respect the patient's privacy and, their right to make choices. But you also got to think about keeping everyone safe, especially when you consider like Brown's response letter to the psychiatrist. He thanked him for the interesting and informative meeting and then talks about wanting to cure the psychiatrist and change his seeds. Like that's not exactly a normal reaction to a psych evaluation, is it?
No, not at all. That letter, along with his, increasingly erratic behavior, it paints a very worrying picture.
Hey.
But back then, he wasn't considered dangerous.
So you have Brown struggling with his mental health, his career's falling apart, and then this this thing happens, like I guess you'd call it a triggering incident. He gets into a huge argument at a welding shop over a lawnmower engine repair and a traveler's check that they wouldn't accept.
And this is where we see this really chilling foreshadowing. Brown says he actually threatens to kill everybody, but unfortunately, like we see so often in these cases, nobody took him seriously.
Yeah, it's like a giant red flag that everyone just ignored. And sadly, what happened next was just awful. It was this act of violence that it's clear he'd been planning for a while. He went and bought 2 shotguns, a semi-automatic rifle, and a bunch of ammunition.
And and the details get even more disturbing. Like just an hour before it happened, he asked his 10-year-old son to come with him and kill a lot of people, even saying they'd go to Hialeah Junior High last. It's just heartbreaking to think about what that kid must have gone through.
It's almost impossible to imagine. And then, just before 11 a.m., Brown shows up at the welding shop on his bicycle, wearing a Panama hat and carrying a shotgun.
It's like something straight out of a nightmare. He walks in through a side door and just starts shooting everyone, often like right up close. It's calculated, it's violent, and it seems like it was fueled by his delusions and his anger.
The sources say he was shouting about sending everyone to Germany while he was, doing this. It was total chaos, and in the end, 8 people were killed and 3 were wounded.
And then amidst all the horror, there's this other really strange detail. Brown he calmly leaves the shop, gets back on his bicycle, and rides away like nothing happened. One witness even described him as looking very passive and very nonchalant, like he was just going for a stroll.
It's such a weird contrast, this
Yeah.
horrible violence, and then he just leaves like it was nothing. It really shows you how messed up his mind was, how disconnected he was from reality. Thankfully, there were 2 witnesses, Mark Cram and Ernest Hammett, who decided to go after him.
Yeah, and that leads to this pretty intense confrontation. Cram, he had a .38 revolver, and he catches up to Brown near the Miami International Airport and fires a shot, which he claimed was a warning shot over Brown's head. But tragically, the bullet hit Brown in the back. It's hard to, to even imagine what must have been going through his head at that moment.
Yeah, it's a tough one to wrap your head around.
Brown, he still had a shotgun, and he turned to face Cram and Hammett, but they actually ran him over with their car and crashed him into a concrete light pole.
Oh, wow, that's intense.
Yeah, he died shortly after,
Yeah.
and they found 20 unused shells in his pockets. So it's like a violent end to a really violent and senseless act.
Yeah, for sure. It's a tragedy all around, especially for the victims and their families. It's easy to get caught up in the details of Brown's story, but it's so important to remember the real people whose lives were changed forever that day.
Absolutely, it's crucial to remember the names and ages of those who were killed. Nelson Barrios, 46, a welder. Lonnie Jeffries, 53, a crane operator. Carl Lee, 47, the manager of the shop. Ernestine Moore, 67, the shop owner's mother. Manga Moore, 78, the shop owner's uncle. Martha Steelman, 29, a secretary. Juan Ramon Trespalacios, 38, a machinist. And Pedro Vasquez, 44, the shop foreman. These are people with families, friends, dreams, lives full of potential, and it was all taken away in an instant.
And then there are those who were injured. Eduardo Lima, 30, Carlos Vesquez Sr., 42, and Carlos Vesquez Jr., who was only 17 years old. It's hard to even imagine the physical and emotional scars they must carry. It really hits home that these acts of violence, they don't just affect the people directly involved. They have this ripple effect that touches families, communities, and society as a whole.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of the long-lasting impact of these tragedies. And speaking of lasting impact, the aftermath of the shooting led to some interesting legal developments. Robert Steelman, Martha's husband, he actually filed lawsuits against both the gun store where Brown bought his weapons and the gun manufacturer itself.
Wow, I hadn't thought about that. What were the arguments behind those lawsuits?
Well, they basically argued that the gun store and the manufacturer, they were partly responsible for what happened. Like, could they have done something to prevent the shooting, especially considering Brown's, documented mental health problems?
That's a really complicated issue. It makes you think about, where does the responsibility really lie in cases like this? Is it all on the individual, or do the people who provide the means, do they share some of the blame?
Yeah, it's a debate that's still going on today, especially with all the gun violence we see. There are strong arguments on both sides. Some people say that, holding manufacturers or sellers liable for what individuals do, it could set a dangerous precedent. But others argue that they have a moral and legal obligation to make sure their products aren't used to hurt people.
Right, right. And then you have to think about the impact on Brown's family, especially his young son who, almost became a part of this horrible thing. I can't imagine the trauma they went through.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the consequences of these acts, they reach far beyond the immediate victims. They leave behind so much pain and suffering that can last for generations.
It's a lot to take in. So looking back at Brown's story, we're left with these really tough questions. Like, how could someone who, on the surface, seemed to have a normal life, how could they fall into such darkness? What role did his declining mental health play in all of this? And were there any missed chances to step in, to intervene, and maybe even prevent this tragedy?
I think what really gets me is just how many warning signs there were.
Yeah.
The failed marriage, refusing therapy, his behavior getting more and more erratic, the things he was saying, and even that direct threat to kill everybody. But somehow these signs were either missed or just dismissed.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if we as a society, if we take threats seriously enough, do we have the right systems in place to identify and help people who might be a danger to themselves or others? These are questions we really need to think about.
For sure. And beyond those systemic issues, Brown's case also makes us face this uncomfortable truth that sometimes even the people closest to us can be hiding darkness that we don't see, or maybe we just choose to ignore it.
That's a sobering thought. We
Yeah.
all want to believe that we really know the people in our lives, but Brown's story shows you just how unpredictable people can be. There was this cassette tape they found in his house where he called himself Logos and said he was this mythical figure who controlled the universe.
Hmm.
He talked about God speaking through him and being responsible for both the good and bad sounds in people's heads.
That's that's a really fascinating detail. It's like that tape gives us a look into his delusional thinking, into a world that made sense to him, even if it didn't to anyone else. It's a scary reminder that sometimes what seems like irrational behavior is actually driven by deeply held beliefs, even if those beliefs are distorted.
It also shows how complex mental illness is. It's not just about calling people crazy. We need to understand that what they do is often caused by a lot of different things, including their mental state, their life experiences, and their own unique beliefs.
You're exactly right. And that raises another important question. How do we, as a society, balance the need to protect ourselves from potential harm with the need to provide care and support for people who are struggling with mental health issues?
It's a tough balance to find, and there are no easy answers. But Brown's story clearly shows that we need to do better. We need to improve our systems for identifying and addressing mental health concerns, and we need to create a culture of empathy and understanding, not fear and stigma. It's a lot to think about. But it's good to have these conversations.
Yeah, definitely. I
Yeah.
think these deep dives, they help us explore these really tough topics, learn from what's happened in the past, and hopefully use that knowledge to make things better in the future.
Yeah.
It's all about understanding, right?
Yeah, totally. And as we're wrapping up our look at the tragic case of Carl Robert Brown, there's something I want to leave you with, something that really stuck with me as we were going through all of this.
Okay, yeah. What is it?
Well, thinking about all those warning signs in Brown's life, it makes you wonder, what responsibility do we each have, as individuals and as a society to see those signs of mental distress in others and do something? It's easy to look back and say, oh, it was so obvious, but could this whole thing have been prevented if someone had intervened earlier? What if someone had reached out or taken those threats more seriously?
That's the question that hangs over everything, right? It's always easier to look back and say, what should have been done? But when you're in the moment, it's not always so clear. But it's still a question worth asking ourselves. What can we do differently? How can we be more aware of what the people around us are going through, even when they try to hide it?
It's like we need to create a culture where we're looking out for each other and we're not afraid to speak up when something seems wrong, even if it's uncomfortable. We might not always be able to stop these kinds of tragedies, but we can try to build a more supportive and understanding environment, where people feel safe asking for help when they need it.
That's a great point. And it's so important to remember that if you or someone you know is struggling with their mental health, there is help out there. Don't be afraid to reach out. There are people who care and want to help.
For sure. And to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep this conversation going. Talk to your friends, your family, your community. Let's work together to break down the stigma around mental health, and create a world where tragedies like what happened with Carl Robert Brown are a thing of the past.
A goal worth fighting for. It takes all of us being a little more aware, a little more compassionate, and a little more willing to help someone who's struggling.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep having those important conversations.